Eleanor of Aquitaine distinguished herself as one of medieval Europe's wealthiest and most influential women. She was instrumental in placing three of her offspring onto the English throne, and upon her passing, orchestrated a final act of power so cutting that it has been immortalized in history. Eleanor's path to becoming heir began when she was only 5 years old, an ascent rooted in a sorrowful circumstance. The royal lineage included two siblings, Petronilla, a younger sister, and William, a younger brother. Ordinarily, as the male heir, William would have been destined to inherit the kingdom of Aquitaine. However, fate intervened. William's untimely death at the tender age of 4 altered the course of succession. The day Eleanor became the presumptive heir should have marked a joyous turn of events, yet the reality was starkly different. William's demise from tuberculosis was not an isolated tragedy. Eleanor also endured the loss of her mother to the same ailment at merely 5 years of age. The future queen had already suffered the loss of half her immediate family. Upon inheriting her birthright, Eleanor achieved the singular distinction of becoming the first and only woman to govern her own duchy. For many, this alone would represent a pinnacle of achievement, but Eleanor's ambitions were far greater. Her life's journey would traverse a spectrum from inspirational and pioneering accomplishments to heart-wrenching and profoundly tragic episodes. Once established as her father's successor, Eleanor was afforded an education befitting a future monarch. The most eminent scholars of the time instructed the young girl in a wide array of subjects, including science, history, literature, philosophy, and languages. She also achieved mastery in horseback riding, became a compelling and articulate conversationalist, and demonstrated skill in games of strategy such as chess, checkers, and backgammon. Possessing such impressive capabilities, it is hardly surprising that numerous noblemen eagerly pursued the prospect of marrying Eleanor. With her father's death in 1137, Eleanor was immediately thrust into the complex existence of a genuine global leader. The young girl transitioned into the Duchess of Aquitaine, swiftly being placed under the aegis of the King of France, known as Louis the Fat. The French king promptly initiated plans to betroth young Eleanor to his son, Louis. The king dispatched his son, accompanied by 500 men, to propose to the 13-year-old Eleanor and escort her back to the French palace. The King of France's motivation for taking Eleanor under his protection was not driven by pure benevolence. Eleanor's territory, the Duchy of Aquitaine, was the most affluent and extensive province within the country, even surpassing the king's own holdings. By arranging Eleanor's marriage to his son, the king anticipated gaining control of her lands, all without resorting to warfare. Eleanor married Louis, the 17-year-old heir to the French throne, a mere 3 months following her father's death, on August 8, 1137. Eleanor and young Louis officially became the rulers of France. However, King Louis was never initially intended for kingship. His more spirited older brother tragically died in an unforeseen accident during his teenage years. At that juncture, the royal family had been preparing young Louis for a life dedicated to the church. The unfortunate boy had, in essence, been raised by monks. He was characterized as meek, unpretentious, and socially awkward. When the time arrived for him to ascend to the throne, he was woefully unprepared. Yet even greater challenges loomed. When Louis and Eleanor were expected to begin the process of producing an heir, they encountered significant difficulties. Historical accounts suggest that Louis was not a physically virile man, and due to his reluctance to consummate the marriage, the couple remained childless for 7 years into their union. Despite this, the people of France attributed the lack of an heir to one individual, and that individual was Eleanor alone. As if her coerced marriage was not sufficiently burdensome, Eleanor encountered further adversity upon her arrival at the French court. Louis's subjects deeply disliked the prince's new bride, and Eleanor in turn found life at the French palace detestable. Regrettably for Louis, Raoul's former wife was not easily dismissed. In fact, the scorned woman was the niece of the powerful nobleman, Count Theobald II, who was incensed that Louis had permitted Raoul to abandon his bride. As retribution for the king's interference, Count Theobald allied with Pope Innocent II, and once again, the spheres of church and state clashed in warfare. Pope Innocent II did not merely defeat King Louis's forces, he thoroughly humiliated the king. The Pope famously characterized Louis not as a formidable global leader, but rather, in his words, a boy in need of instruction. Subsequently, he excommunicated both Louis and Raoul for their roles in dissolving Raoul's marriage. It was a public relations disaster of medieval proportions, and it was only the beginning. In an unprecedented action for both a queen and a woman, Eleanor insisted on accompanying her husband on the 1145 crusade. Unfortunately for both Eleanor and Louis, the crusade proved to be an utter failure. Despite all the pomp and ceremony surrounding their departure, Louis's armies were soundly defeated by Turkish forces in a humiliating rout. Louis abandoned his troops and fled to Antioch. This marked King Louis's first major military engagement, and it ended in complete calamity. When the time arrived for the French populace to explain the disastrous outcome of the crusade, they did not fault Louis's ineffective leadership. Instead, they directed their blame towards Eleanor. They asserted that Eleanor had encouraged other women to join the crusade, thus distracting their husbands from the holy mission. Had these women not been present, they argued, the holy war would have been victorious. Once again, Eleanor became the scapegoat for all misfortunes. During Louis's ill-fated crusade, a damaging rumor circulated alleging that Eleanor was engaged in an affair with an exceedingly inappropriate individual, her own uncle Raymond, the charming Prince of Antioch. Adding further fuel to the fire, when it was time for Eleanor and Louis to proceed from Antioch to Jerusalem, Eleanor astonished the court by refusing to accompany the king. Instead, she expressed her desire to remain with her uncle Raymond and potentially her supposed lover. By this juncture, Louis was weary and disillusioned by the brutal realities of his crusade. Not only was Edessa, the territory he had initially embarked on the voyage to save, now irrevocably lost, but he had also suffered the loss of countless men, and now his wife was seemingly preoccupied with frivolous dalliances with her attractive uncle. At this point, Louis reached his breaking point. Instead of allowing Eleanor to remain in Antioch, he compelled her to continue to Jerusalem, where he could maintain closer observation of his wife. As Louis attempted to forcibly remove Eleanor towards Jerusalem, she uttered words that would indelibly alter European history. The enraged queen declared that she and her husband should not travel together as husband and wife, citing their consanguinity, stating they were related in the 4th and 5th degrees. In medieval terms, this was an earth-shattering revelation. Technically, royals were prohibited from marrying if they were not separated by at least 7 generations. Louis and Eleanor, however, were only separated by 4 or 5. Now, after 15 unhappy years with Louis, Eleanor had finally reached her limit. She resolved to dissolve their marriage. When Louis and Eleanor arrived in Jerusalem in 1149, they sought an audience with the Pope, requesting him to grant them an annulment. The stated reason was their close familial relation, but in reality, virtually all royal families had intertwined lineages. In actuality, Louis and Eleanor had endured 15 long years of marriage and still lacked a male heir. Furthermore, and more fundamentally, Eleanor simply no longer harbored any affection for Louis. To her profound disappointment, the Pope denied the annulment. Soon, all of Europe was abuzz with rumors of the couple's scandalous attempt to separate. After the Pope refused to grant Louis and Eleanor an annulment, he elected to play peacemaker, endeavoring to reconcile the troubled couple. He hosted the unhappy pair at his residence and directed Louis and Eleanor to a luxurious chamber adorned with silks. Upon entering, a crucial detail became immediately apparent. The room contained only a single bed. The message was unambiguous: fulfill your royal duty and procreate. Meanwhile, Louis's grand Second Crusade had effectively collapsed. Upon leaving Louis, she was compelled to relinquish claims to her children, including young Alice, who was not even 2 years old at the time. They proceeded with the separation, and with this, Aquitaine regained its independence, and the land and title reverted back to Eleanor. A wealthy woman possessing land was a highly sought-after prospect in Eleanor's era, so one might anticipate she would encounter no difficulties upon re-entering the dating scene. Regrettably, this was not the case. Eleanor was indeed desirable, but primarily to the most undesirable suitors: greedy fortune hunters and violent social climbers. While en route home, after separating from Louis, not one but 2 men attempted to abduct her. Their intention was to coerce her into marriage, thereby seizing control of her lands. Eleanor understood the perilous world she inhabited. As long as she remained unmarried, unscrupulous men would persist in attempting to abduct her and plunder her wealth. She needed to act swiftly. Barely 2 months after her annulment, Eleanor proposed marriage to Henry, the future King of England, seeking protection. It was an offer he could not refuse, despite their union causing a stir across Europe for two significant reasons. Europe was astonished to learn that Eleanor had married Henry. At 28 years old, Eleanor was a remarkable 11 years older than her 19-year-old husband. Furthermore, Henry was the brother of one of the men who had attempted to kidnap Eleanor and force her into marriage. Now, Eleanor's second husband, Henry, was everything Louis was not. Brave, energetic, ambitious, and reputedly hot-tempered. He and Eleanor formed a powerful partnership, and by 1154 they reigned as King and Queen of England. Even more favorably, the couple evidently shared a passionate intimacy. Eleanor gave birth to 8 children, and in stark contrast to the stress over her inability to bear a son with Louis, she and Henry had 5 sons. It seemed Eleanor and Henry were an ideal match, but their harmonious existence was not destined to endure indefinitely. When Eleanor's former husband, King Louis, learned of her marriage to Henry, he was considerably incensed. Not only had she remarried without his consent, which protocol dictated she required, but the union of Henry and Eleanor's territories meant that Henry, who was technically King Louis's subordinate, now commanded control over half of France. In essence, Eleanor had succeeded in divorcing the King of France and somehow emerging even more powerful than him. Some of Louis's anger may have stemmed from jealousy, but he possessed one legitimate grievance against Eleanor. She had divorced him under the pretext of being too closely related, only to then marry Henry II, who was an even closer relative. The enraged French king responded in the manner any royal might. He declared war on his former wife and her new husband. Engaging in battle did not prove advantageous for Louis, who had a demonstrably poor track record in military strategy. He suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of Henry's capable forces. Now, with 5 sons, Eleanor's political legacy seemed assured, but by 1189 the family had endured so many tragedies that only a few of the sons remained. The couple's firstborn, William, died at just 3 years old. Years later, in a bizarre accident, their son Geoffrey was trampled to death during a jousting tournament in Paris. However, the most unsettling death was that of the couple's heir, Henry the Younger. Henry Jr. and his father did not maintain the most amicable relationship. Henry II was consumed by power and resisted granting his heir even minor landholdings or responsibilities. Over the years, Henry the Younger grew increasingly resentful. When his father decided to bestow some of Henry Jr.'s castle to his younger brother John, Henry lost his composure. He was 18 years old, poised to rule, and deeply affronted by his controlling father. Little Henry was not alone in his discontent with the king. Eleanor and Henry's other sons, Richard and Geoffrey, were also displeased with their father. The sons conspired together and devised a daring plan. They would revolt against their father, depose him, and seize the throne. One night, while young Henry and his father were engaged in affairs of state, the heir stealthily departed the fortress, abandoning his father and instead fleeing to another court. Henry the Younger had married a French princess whose father happened to be King Louis, Eleanor's ex-husband. Following Eleanor's departure, he had taken a new wife and had even more daughters, one of whom married Eleanor's son with her second spouse, King Henry II. Thus, young Henry had not only deserted his father, but had defected to an enemy court, and the bad news continued to accumulate. Between 1173 and 1174, 2 more individuals joined forces with young Henry and King Louis in a shocking twist. They were none other than the king's own sons, Richard and Geoffrey. Together, the sons plotted to overthrow their father and seize the throne. And what role did Eleanor play while the men in her family turned against each other? Suffice it to say, she enthusiastically supported her children's rebellious phase, pledging allegiance to her sons. Eleanor ascended to the top spot on her husband's list of personal enemies, though the marriage had been deteriorating for some time prior. By 1167, the couple had begun to drift apart, and by 1173, their once passionate bond had cooled to icy indifference. Consequently, when Henry learned that his 13- and 14-year-old sons, Richard and Geoffrey, had suddenly allied with his rebellious heir, he knew precisely who was orchestrating the defection. Eleanor had not merely passively condoned her son's revolt. She had actively engineered it herself. Henry was enraged, and he vowed to seek retribution. To this day, historians remain uncertain as to the precise motivations for Eleanor's betrayal of her husband. Only one final action remained. She needed to reach Paris to join the French court and command her troops. She disguised herself in men's attire and embarked on the perilous journey. Unbeknownst to her, this trip would prove to be her undoing. As Eleanor stealthily traveled through France en route to Paris, she was abruptly surrounded. Henry's forces had tracked her down, and with the queen in their grasp, they showed no mercy. They took Eleanor captive without publicly announcing her arrest and imprisoned her in various castles and fortresses for 16 long years. By 1189, Henry was nearing 60 years of age, and the years of relentless conflict had taken a heavy toll. He ultimately died with his two remaining sons united in opposition against him. With King Henry's death, his son Richard finally obtained the power he had long yearned for. After Eleanor conducted a triumphant tour through England with her son Richard, she orchestrated one final triumph, persuading her troublesome son John to reconcile with his older brother. As the brothers embraced after so many years of conflict, Eleanor felt a sense of peace. On March 31st, 1204, the indomitable queen breathed her last. But even as she departed this world, she had arranged one final gotcha moment. Eleanor is interred next to her husband, Henry II, and her son, Richard the Lionheart. Given everything Henry had subjected Eleanor to, one might assume she would not wish to spend eternity alongside him, and that assumption would be correct. That is why, even in death, she managed to deliver one last jab at her boorish husband. Eleanor had her tomb constructed a few inches higher than her husband's, eternally elevating her above him for all time. Thanks for watching History Exposed. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us.